rights. We are a live weekly discussion and podcast about data ownership, digital rights, and your privacy. In episode 26, we talk about OFAC and Tornado Cash. Calling this episode OFAC's Attack on Free Speech. On August 8th, 2022, the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Asset Control sanctioned the virtual currency mixer Tornado Cash. And a few days later, Dutch authorities arrested a man suspected of being involved with Tornado Cash, the cryptocurrency mixing service. So we'll get to why shortly. But we want to talk about what is Tornado Cash and why did OFAC act. I'm Jeff Jokish, founder of Privacy Plan and a local data privacy researcher. I live at the intersection of privacy and data about privacy. I'm here with my co-host, Christian Kmeyer, managing partner at Sustain Capital. Chris runs a VC fund that focuses on blockchain tech. He's into privacy, identity, the future of money, and also central bank digital currencies. I like to say he lambasts central bank digital currencies, but he doesn't like that designation, so I'll let him explain it. Say hi, Chris.
Hey, well, the devil's in the detail as always. It all depends on obviously how you implement things, and this holds true for quote-unquote currencies, and this holds true for any type of speech, which I include money in, as in the primary function of money is actually that of language of value. I've wrote about this extensively, but I won't bore you with this at the moment. But yeah, what happened on Monday is by many, including myself, perceived as one of the worst attacks on free speech, and it's kind of very reminiscent. A lot of people have pointed this out of the early days of crypto, as in the early cypherpunk movements, where a few people really fought the NSA and other government entities for the right to use strong encryption for privacy protection. And this feels and smells a lot like the same, and there's obviously a lot more to say about that, but we'll leave that mostly to our guest Thomas today. Thomas, you want to say hi?
Yeah, let's introduce him. So we've also have with us here Tom Besor, privacy and crypto lawyer. Introduce yourself, Tom.
Well, good afternoon, gentlemen. Coming to you today from Seattle, Washington, where I've been following very closely these developments since last Monday. And yes, that was very significant to put Tornado Cash on the list, the targeted list. But even more significant was the arrest in the Netherlands of a developer of Tornado Cash. I'm still trying to figure out if it was the creator or just a random developer, but it's obviously somebody who drew the attention of the Dutch authorities anyway, as somebody who's very instrumental in helping people operate through Tornado Cash. And this happened just a couple of days ago, where this fellow was put behind bars. He had no contact with his wife since, and it's really adding more and more fuel to this fire of what's going on with Tornado Cash. So very timely topic you guys have selected for today.
Yeah, and obviously Coin Center has done a lot of great work right away when this became public. So a lot of the notes that we took are from the Coin Center article, but then we also grabbed some other information that was out there. So I just wanted to inject one particular statement for anybody who's listening and hasn't read this already. That's kind of very important to understand. So what does this mean in practice for every American, right? So not only for people that are like active in the crypto space, either as investors or users or just building technologies. It means in practice that no American can send or receive money that are either going to or coming from these addresses, these Ethereum addresses that the Office of Foreign Office of Foreign Asset Control lists, and by just receiving funds from these addresses, you're immediately in violation of these sanctions laws. So there's actually, from a practical perspective, nothing that the recipient can do about that, right? Just like if someone was to take some cash and throw it through your mailbox slit in your door, there's basically nothing that you can do to stop it. Actually, it would be easier to stop that. Just close it shut. But if you have an address that's public and kind of by default addresses are public, then if you're an American, you might be in violation, and oftentimes you might not even know that you are in violation. So it's a very pertinent topic to every U.S. citizen.
It's almost like getting swatted, right? Where you call the FBI and sick them on somebody, right? If you're connected to any of these addresses, and it doesn't even have to be like directly connected. If it's connected by 1 level, 2 levels, 3 levels, you're probably tainted by a connection to Tornado Cash now. So if you send money to Tornado Cash or receive money from Tornado Cash and then pass that along to somebody else, they're now implicated by connection.
Yeah, and it has an enormous ripple.
Crazy.
Yeah, it has an enormous ripple effect, and I assume a lot of people will already know this as are listening to this, but the ripple effect being that actually the custodial exchanges are reacting to this, as in they monitor those addresses, and if you're receiving funds or sending funds to those addresses, you have your custodied funds frozen.
Yeah, that's happened to a bunch of people already.
Yeah, I mean that's
Crazy.
absolutely unbelievable, right? Because I mean there's no way, obviously, that you can say that these people did something wrong. There's no process to mitigate against that other than filing this really cumbersome licensing thing that we can talk about. But maybe, Thomas, do you want to talk about that procedure? Kind of moving backwards from what can we do. I always try to be practical about things, as in what's the best thing we can do.
Basically, you're guilty until proven innocent. You can apply. There's a procedure where you can apply to have your permission to retract your funds out of there. But the important thing to know is there's a lot of people that have been using Tornado Cash. And yes, there's a significant criminal element to it, but I think it's like 30% of all transactions through Tornado Cash have known criminal origins. That means 70% is legitimate uses. So 70% of the people that have used this to maintain their privacy in whatever financial transaction they have a rightful expectation of, those 70% have effectively had their funds frozen if they're still within the mechanism and haven't been withdrawn out yet. So it's a huge burden on free speech and a huge burden on due process that came by administrative, I like to say by administrative fiat, so to speak, to pull in the fiat term, the money term. But it's an extension of the administrative state. It's just nuts the way what's going on. And it's not just a few people crying wolf. Some significant people in the constitutional law realm have been raising the alarm bell. This is big news, and people can talk it down, but this is where it all starts.
Right, and that's Tornado Cash has mixed something like $7 billion in virtual currency since it came into existence in 2019, and I think Chris has actually got a breakdown.
Yeah.
How those funds were how we think those funds have broken out. Right?
Yeah, so Chainalysis published a report, and according to that report, 17.7, so less than 18% of the funds that went through Tornado Cash can be attributed to sanctioned entities under OFAC. And then there's a separate category of what they call stolen funds, and that's where I have a question for Thomas right away, which is 10.5%. And then the majority of the funds that are going through Tornado Cash are associated to decentralized finance transactions. So that is probably requires more definitions there, obviously, because that's a broad category. But the question that I have is specifically for these quote-unquote stolen funds, because stolen funds strikes me as not necessarily automatically being something that OFAC should be concerned about, right? Because isn't it true that if these are funds that were stolen by citizens, then that would still fall outside of their area of competence?
It sounds reasonable assertion to me. OFAC shouldn't be involved in that. They're painting with a very broad brush. Let's just leave it at that.
Do you guys, do you want to address the situation? I mean, there are multiple entities that can regulate this, right? So OFAC has sort of stepped in. Probably most people have never actually even heard of OFAC, maybe before this discussion, right? I mean, FinCEN probably has a broader, maybe is more well known to the public, right? And they regulate a lot of financial institutions. OFAC has been around for a long time, I think since the 50s. But they've got a broader mandate to sort of protect the entire public rather than just regulate financial entities. So they do probably have a bigger mandate here to be able to do these kinds of things. But one of the things that's interesting is that FinCEN actually ruled, I think a couple of years ago, that they did not think that distributed applications like Tornado Cash belonged on this list. Or I think that they didn't really qualify in the same way as organizations and entities. And now
that's striking. That's striking because it's a similar organization within the auspices of the Treasury Department, and they've drawn opposite conclusions. So it doesn't make any sense. What I'm interested in is tracing this. There's an individual or there's a group that has made this decree. And I'd just love to trace that back and find out who. I'd love to see some transparency. Yeah. Who's making these rules and who are they accountable to?
Yeah. Well, Chris and I were both listening in on a Twitter Spaces event earlier today where some folks in the DeFi space were sort of talking about this, and they sort of supposed that there's some elements in the government that decided that maybe too much was too much, and that they needed to do something about North Korea, and that there was some pressure applied, and maybe they sort of overstepped here. But now there's no easy way to backtrack.
Well, that's a question, obviously, for Thomas. Sorry, Thomas, for interrupting you, but maybe to hone in on that. So there is a process, right? So there is a process to get something removed from there, but obviously there's two hindrances there. A, who has kind of standing, if that's the right term in this context, who is being violated and can request that removal. And then I have the list here, what are the reasons, which are kind of very generic. So one reason is if the persons that are being listed there are actually US persons. And so you could probably make an argument that would be a little bit of a stretch, I guess, for that particular item. Then if the behavior of that person changed, or then there's a very broad line item if the designation was made in error for some reason, which to me, there's not some reason, but there's kind of many reasons that seem to be rather obvious for most people in the space, including myself. And then the last one, if the designation exceeds Treasury's statutory or constitutional authority for some reason, which that even widens it much more. But yeah.
Here's what you're misunderstanding. These exemptions are applied to people, and the whole law is supposed to apply to a person. But here we're talking about a piece of computer code, and so a computer code has neither standing nor capacity to make these arguments. And who's going to make it on their behalf? Because the original developers of this protocol have nothing to do with it anymore. It's just free source code that's put out on the blockchain, and so it's not, the regulation is not fit for purpose, so to speak. And these exemptions that you're speaking of may be utilized by some individuals who have been impacted by having their funds frozen. They could try to make use of this, but again, it's not really fit for purpose. It would be far better to institute some more general legal proceeding against the government to try to have this removed because it exceeds the authority of the government.
Yes.
Tom, I agree with you there wholeheartedly, but I've heard some people make the argument, and I don't think this is necessarily OFAC making the argument, though they may be sort of leaking this to try to make the argument in public without actually making it themselves. But I've heard some people making the argument that OFAC did this under the auspices of Tornado Cash being a DAO, and them essentially regulating the DAO as an organization.
Sure, and that is definitely possible that there is an entity, but the entity is separate and distinct from the code itself. And there has not been enough information released on this. I'm very interested in this because I hear the DAO does have a certain treasury, and those funds are going to be claimed apparently by the government. But this is a story that's just beginning in process. You really have to stay tuned because we need far more information than we have at hand. And the people who are impacted financially by this are going to come forward in the coming days and weeks, presumably to try to recover their property that they've been deprived of. And also, hopefully, some of our big organizations like the Coin Center, the Blockchain Association, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and the troops are rallying, and it's just going to take a little bit of time to coordinate efforts and get some kind of legal action going to reverse this.
Yeah, and Jeff and I were actually communicating with the Electronic Frontier Foundation during the week, and there is a chance that someone will join later on. So I don't think I speak out of terms if they are actually preparing a legal action against Treasury in regards to that particular action.
Yeah, I know that those things are in the works in a number of different organizations, and hopefully they're going to coordinate their actions.
Well, certainly $5 billion is not going to remain silent, right? I mean, of the $7 billion that was frozen, at least $5 billion of it is apparently not illegitimate, right? And those people aren't going to shut it forever.
Yeah, but bringing this closer to home, as a privacy advocate and as a technologist, I've had my eye on several different privacy coins, not the least of which is Tornado Cash. But you've got Monero, you've got Zcash, you've got any number of different iterations of privacy-oriented protocols. And I have had in my mind that wouldn't it be cool to know how to use these? Shouldn't I, as a professional, have some experience with this? Shouldn't I be putting some funds through this code and see how it operates? And I've thought of this, and I'm like, thankfully I didn't do it because imagine if I had put some small portion, $100 or whatever, through Tornado Cash just to see how it works, and then all of a sudden I'd have my entire address blocked or flagged as a criminal. It's just stupid. It doesn't make any sense. But it's just got a chilling effect on free speech, on the ability to use code for good. And it's not going to stand, and it's got a lot of people up in arms, but it's going to take some time because, to be quite honest with you, the government can do whatever they want, and it's just a matter of retracting that power through the legal process, through a long and drawn-out legal process.
Yeah, and so on our end, what we do is we consult for non-government organizations that support dissidents that live under authoritarian governments. And so our contributions there is to create these recommendation papers, review recommendation papers in regards to how these individuals can interact with digital technologies. So there is an actual recommendation in many of those papers that suggest to funnel funds through this tool for privacy reasons, and the ostensible purpose is obvious, right? It's because these people are being persecuted oftentimes by their own governments, and oftentimes for such crimes as disagreeing with the government opinion. And so these people are relying on funds coming through these particular channels, and they're all of a sudden stranded. So yeah, I want to see a lot of these organizations aggregate the data and show the actual damages that this action had to individuals around the world, not only in the United States, right? They're basically victims. Like if you just look at the statistics, the Treasury seems to have decided that it's okay to cause kind of collateral damage for every kind of criminal that they catch. They kind of affect 4 innocent people at the same time. That seems outrageous.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And my goal, I'd love to find a way to shine a light on the process of how this happens. I mean, is it in a dark room somewhere? Who's in charge of this?
Yeah, which is also kind of a very weird process, right? Given the fact that this is an entity that's obviously funded by taxes of US citizens, that there's no transparency to how this came about. Is kind of more or less this nonchalant press release to the extent of we decided that these addresses should no longer be be used, and there's no justification given, and then ostensibly there's also false numbers being cited, because the Justice Department, the Treasury Department, made the claim that basically all funds that touched it are illicit, which seems utterly absurd, right?
Yeah, it's a brave new world we're living in, and this is so unprecedented. This is definitely something new, never in the history of this type of list has it been applied to computer code. It just doesn't make sense. It's not fit for purpose. Again, it's just, where did they come up with this? And I do understand the problem. Now, let's be realistic. We know that there's a problem with the movement of illicit funds, especially to bad actors in North Korea. We all know that there's a problem, but what to do about that problem is not to inhibit free speech and violate due process. And, these constitutional concepts that we hold dear. You don't just do that. It's just...
Let's talk a little bit about this in context, right? One of the things that happened in addition to OFAC actually, essentially saying that you can't send money back and forth through this distributed DeFi protocol, is that the Dutch authorities then arrested one of the developers, and apparently he hasn't even been charged with anything other than apparently helping develop this code.
Oh no, there's a possibility that it could be used for illicit purposes. That was a statement, a semi-quote coming out of the Dutch authorities in the past couple of days.
For concealing, quote, concealing criminal financial flows, right?
Right.
But yeah, that's pretty crazy. I talked with Chris about this earlier in the week, about how this is very similar to what the NSA tried to do back in the 1970s and 1980s with keeping public key encryption out of the hands of Americans. Any kind of real encryption, right? Because encryption in our software didn't really exist back then. And when we were starting to really build applications like Lotus Notes and Microsoft Office and stuff like that, people wanted to keep their files safe. And so they started to build encryption into it. But the government didn't want us to have any secrecy. And so they essentially made all of those encryption techniques really weak, especially the stuff that was exportable. And when researchers started to try to figure out good cryptology, especially public key cryptology, they would find them and they would essentially coerce them into silence, or recruit them, one or the other, until finally a couple of people developed something and put it into the public domain, which was PGP, right? And that sort of broke the floodgates, opened the floodgates. But otherwise, we may not have had PGP or a really good encryption for another 15 years, because they were essentially clamping down on what was essentially free speech. And in fact, they may have actually arrested the guy who was going to release PGP, had he not just released it onto the internet for free.
Yeah, and that's a good analogy, Jeff, because we're seeing the same thing here. If we take a step back, a lot of this is public relations stuff, because the code is still out there. The code is still freely usable. It's never coming off the blockchain. And it can be copied, it can be iterated, it could be developed into something different. And there's literally dozens of different privacy-oriented projects in development that cannot be stopped. And so it's just a matter of the government making a public statement, trying to make some noise that they're watching. But the reality of the situation is the technology will march on regardless of what OFAC does, but regardless of what the United States does or the Dutch government, because we're in a new day and age where people have control. And this is what's so threatening to governments everywhere, because control of the money, the markets, the rules, the regulations, this is very important to them. And it's a battle that we're going to see only become greater as the years go on. We live in a very exciting time. This is is no different than the evolution of encryption and privacy that you were mentioning.
Well, Tom, you're not in favor of terrorism, right? You're not in favor of child molestation. I mean, none of us are, right? But do we really actually think that this move by OFAC is actually going to keep, North Korea from doing what they do? Is it really going to slow them down? They're just going to find another channel, right?
They already have.
Yeah, right. Did it change anything at all?
No, it's a constant battle. And of course nobody's in favor of those things. And I hope that the government does come up with effective means to attack these problems without impairing our fundamental rights.
Right. What concerns me is that it's always an impingement on our privacy rights. And I'm beginning to wonder whether the government really thinks we have any right to financial privacy, maybe even privacy writ large, the way they make these kinds of moves.
Well, to echo something that Thomas said earlier, I think it's important to not try and personify or anthropomorphize government, because governments are functions of society. I think it's always really, really important to the point that Thomas made earlier, to identify the interest behind this action. Because it's not like everybody in government obviously was aware of what was happening, every person that holds some public office. There were definitely some particular individuals and very likely motivated by some other interest, presumably. Because to make this simple, what's kind of the motivation here? So I'm always against coming up with conspiracy theories. I always default to believing that people just made an error and just erroneously caused this particular action, unless there is a number of reasons that point to a different motivation. So if it turns out that this was a long planned action and that other documents, including the FinCEN document, was reviewed, then this would point more to something that's very intentional on behest of some other interest, right? But yeah, I think this kind of, let's call it culpability, responsibility path is very important to follow, and not assign a big label to this government did. Government doesn't do anything. People do something, and people have their own motivations that should be identified.
Great point, Chris.
That's very true, but at the same time, we can address the government as a bureaucratic process, competing bureaucratic processes, as we see with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission in general, fighting for control over crypto, versus the Commodities Future Trading Bureau, versus the FTC now, which has recently jumped into the act. These general groups of actors do, as entities, seek to fill a role and expand their roles as they individually see fit, well beyond the legislation under which they've been created. I just read something, I think it was in Forbes, where there's this talk of the administrative state developing a life of its own and expanding beyond the directives of Congress. And there was recently a Supreme Court decision involving the state of Virginia and the EPA, where the U.S. Supreme Court said, no, you cannot there's no unlimited expansion of your administrative authority. You have to see what the purposes of Congress were. Do you have specific authorization to go after these challenges? And this is especially important as technology advances at such a rapid rate, technology and innovation. There's no general broad mandate for these administrative agencies to have control of this without the direction of Congress. Because again, you've got the administrative state versus the legislative state, and things need to begin with the legislature. And I wish I could remember the site for this case. It was recently handed down. EPA, the whole collection of rules and regulations they were trying to assert was ruled unconstitutional because it extended well beyond their directives from Congress.
Is that the one in regards to carbon emissions?
Yes,
Oh, yeah. I'll put this into the show notes. Yeah. So
We've got three big concepts we're talking about here. We're talking about due process violations. We're talking about free speech violations, and we're talking about administrative versus legislative powers. They're checking all the boxes here with this innovative technology. So it's great that we're having these conversations. It's just sad that some elements are putting the cart before the horse and taking these unilateral actions to such a degree that it's definitely ruffling some feathers. We've only begun to see the results of this, so we're so early.
Yeah, I mean, but even in the executive branch, we already have seen dissent. I mean, famously, Hester Peirce tends to disagree with most things that Gary Gensler says in regards to crypto, and thinks about it way more nuanced and way more intelligent as far as I'm concerned, whereas he keeps making broad sweeping statements that seem generalized inaccuracies, right? And the same holds true for the CFTC. So I have some hope there that sounder minds will ultimately prevail, but they need to be able to rely on us to amplify that particular message and make sure that those overriding concerns that these people put forth, because it seems to be always the same, right? It's always kind of quote unquote national security, child molesters, and other nonsense that they put forth that the American public needs to be protected from, which is always a smokescreen. And it's kind of this whole
terrorists, child molesters, and privacy advocates.
And privacy advocates, yeah. The awful privacy advocates like Jeff, like making a stink that people should be owning their own data. Yeah, that's really unfortunate. But I want to always make sure we get to
tax cheats.
And tax cheats are really bad too. That's why we need to hire more IRS agents and increase the budget by billions of dollars. That seems like money really well spent, disallocating funds from left to right. That's always very useful. But yeah, to more important points. So Thomas, did you get a chance to read the FOIA request that DeFi organization filed? Did you have any thoughts on that? Otherwise, I have some thoughts on that.
I think it was a great PR move. I don't know what the expectations are. I mean, it was just another volley in this battle, but I read some commentary that was not necessarily impressed with that, just because, why? Do you really think they're going to be responsive to that, and in what period of time? The real action needs to come from a legal perspective, in my opinion. Somebody needs to file a lawsuit to get that process started.
Yeah, so actually I want to get back to the culpability here. So it occurs to me that this action is gross negligent on whoever had the decision-making authority. Is there any recourse that harmed individuals have in these cases?
I wouldn't think so, but I'm not necessarily an expert on that particular subject. Individual, you're talking about individual culpability of a government bureaucrat?
Yeah, so
this decree?
Yeah, because let's make a Mickey Mouse example, and let's say I'm an official having an official office, holding an official office for one of the executive branches, and let's say I'm driving with my government-issued vehicle, and I'm texting, and I'll drive over someone and badly hurt them. Right?
Sure. Acting outside the scope of your duties in a gross and negligent manner.
Yeah, so
sure.
to me, it seems such a blatant violation of what you already mentioned, overstepping their legal authority, and then setting the constitutional concerns aside, that they should have known, as in this is gross negligent behavior, and you should have investigated further whether or not you are harming people actively by doing this, right?
Yeah, but isn't this law enforcement, and isn't this like within the realm of their job? Doesn't that give them like
carte blanche? No.
Well,
not carte blanche, but isn't there some legal precedent that everybody hates that cops always use to get off whenever they abuse somebody's rights? But I forget what they call that.
No, the long arm of the law still reaches that, as you know from the police brutality and killings of people of color. There have been repercussions. People are in prison because of that. So,
Yeah.
there's no escape from the long arm of the law. But whether that could be extended to this bureaucratic debacle that we're experiencing right now, I would tend to doubt it.
Yeah, so under European law, there's this concept of if it was gross negligent, and there's very tight definitions in certain context around that. Does this exist in these cases for Treasury that you know of?
I was talking about qualified immunity. Rob from the comments put that forward.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether it applies, but that's what I was thinking about.
I don't know. I don't think there's going to be any action against any individuals. I hope to be surprised in that regard, but I'm not holding my breath for that. I'm more interested in the agency accountability. That should be an easier target.
Well, it comes back to motives at the end of the day, right? If it turns out that they acted on behest of some other entity, and maybe there was even, again, I don't want to fuel any conspiracy theories. At the same point in time, it seems so obviously an overstepping of the legal authority. So let's say it was discovered that someone was incentivized to do that, right? To me, this is a criminal act, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if this is a useful analysis. I'm just more concerned with the basic constitutional analysis of deprivation of property without due process,
Right.
the inhibition of free speech in the terms of computer code, and it's phenomenal. It's just so fundamentally outrageous that
Yeah.
I can't wait to see the dust start to settle on this.
Well, I mean, obviously, it's setting a very dangerous precedent if it's going to stand, and so that was kind of what I was getting at. As in, we might need, and to me that would be a good form of action, we might need to set an equally unprecedented countermeasure here, right? So like Nixon impeachment type thing, right? Where it came out that this was just criminal behavior. Someone accepted a bribe or whatever it was. It just seems so outside of the norm. You know what I mean, Thomas? It just seems so unlikely that persons that initiated this particular action were unaware of the FinCEN determination, were unaware of the fact that they were actually catching mostly innocent people with this particular action, were unaware of the ripple effects. It just seems very unlikely that at the spur of the moment or within a couple of days even, they made this decision lightly to say, okay, we're going to list that, and we just put out a press release. I don't know how they work, but it just strikes me it's something that you wouldn't just accidentally do, right?
Yeah, you'd think some thought would have gone into it. Hopefully there's some kind of committee of individuals that make policy decisions as to how they're going to tackle challenging issues.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no doubt that these are challenging issues. The government is losing control of its ability to enforce and go after illicit actors. It's definitely a problem. So from that perspective, it's not really new or surprising. But the specific mechanism that they're choosing to go after.
Yeah. So in theory, Treasury has 20 days, I believe, to respond to this FOIA request. But in practice, I read that they usually, or any agency for that matter, will drag their feet with some whatever reason.
Yeah, they can drag their feet forever.
Forever?
I've submitted a bunch of them.
Okay. Yeah, tell us about your experience there.
Yeah, they can delay that for pretty much forever. I mean, you have legal recourse, but you can't really get anywhere with those things.
Is there any injunctive relief that you can think of, Thomas?
No, I don't. Again, this is not. I don't practice litigation in this respect, so I'm probably not the best one to comment on specific injunctive relief or other judicial remedies. But you can be sure that there are people addressing this, those who have been financially impacted by this. There's big money involved.
Yeah. For FOIA requests, it's sort of impossible to prove at this point in time what pieces of data they have. So, if they have 9 out of the 10 pieces of data, they can reject your request because they don't have all 10. right? They could have like a billion different excuses for why they don't, actually return the information that you request. There's all kinds of little, ways that they can do that.
Yeah, actually, I had a separate question there. So my initial gut response was when I read the particular FOIA request that I would have asked more questions and more precise questions. But then, like after thinking about this for a day more, maybe it's more interesting if a lot of people file these separately, like one question each. I think that will make it harder for the agency to drag their feet on that, right? So as in, I just ask one particular question, like that could even pertain to like just my particular case, whatever that case might be, and ask for that answer. And if enough people do that, maybe we'll get some answers, right? Because it seems to be much easier to answer a yes/no question if you formulate it carefully, or something that's just very, very specific. But 1,000 people in some coordinated way all ask one question each. So maybe
I think that, as I mentioned before, I don't mean to trivialize the FOIA process, because it certainly has proved its importance many, many times since the 1950s when it was instituted. Many journalistic bombshells have resulted from FOIA requests. There's a huge history there, so it is important. But from our immediate perspective, I think these issues are of such importance and such scale that they ought to be resolved outside of the bounds of a FOIA request. I think somebody of some authority and importance should be asking some very pointed questions. Some congressional members who are in charge of the Treasury Department, whatever committee holds them accountable, they should have a hearing. These questions should be put in front of a body of individuals that have the authority to ask these questions. And I think that the public pressure that can come to bear from our interest groups like the Blockchain Association, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, there's any number of privacy-oriented groups that should really be up in arms about this and should have the immediate resources to make a phone call. I would hope that this is of that degree of importance, and that it just wouldn't be some random person filing a FOIA request.
Why don't we have any politicians speaking out about this yet? Is it because it's anathema to go against the law enforcement directive here because it's North Korea?
Maybe the politicians have some money tied up in tornado cash. I don't know. I don't know why. Who are among our most vocal advocates?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I mean, it used to be a lot of conservative politicians, but that's changed a whole lot in the past few years.
Yeah, so ostensibly the Office of Foreign Asset Control has 15 days to respond to removal request, and we kind of already touched on the fact that it's unclear who could petition OFAC to have this action taken. But in my mind, anybody who is related to that action in any shape or form, received funds from that smart contract, should have standing, as far as I'm concerned, right?
Absolutely.
So yeah, let's everybody file that, and then I think there's going to be there's obviously thousands of people impacted, and there's a written correspondence piece to that, and I guess most people, hopefully, that are affected already looked for that and found it, but there's also an online form to do so. And I think that as many people as possible should reach out to Treasury, including anybody who quote-unquote got dusted, saying, I want my 0.1 Ether, and I think you didn't have the authority, so I shouldn't have to ask for, a license, right? Which is also kind of an interesting thing that this is even called this way. Do you have any insights why it's formulated this way? Why it is a license to receive that money?
No, it's just the latest, greatest bureaucratic tool in their kit. It kind of reminds me of civil forfeiture proceedings when the government seizes property that may or may not be fruits of illicit enterprise like drug dealing.
Mm-hmm.
If you pull you over in your car and you've got a trunk load of $10 bills that amounts to $100,000, they're going to seize that cash and initiate a civil forfeiture proceedings, because what else could it possibly be besides illicit funds? And the victim in those matters is welcome to file a petition to recover their funds and prove the source and prove their innocence.
Prove their innocence.
And that's used all the time in America. There's been exposés on it on 60 Minutes and other places. It's the civil forfeiture proceedings. It can apply to houses that are purported drug houses, or airplanes, or boats, or cash stores. There are mechanisms that our government has to go after us to dubious challenges. And this is just the way of life. And it's up to us, and it's up to those who advocate on our behalf to muster the resources to challenge that effectively. And I have no doubt that the crypto world has some great advocates that are going to rise to these challenges. It's just not going to happen this week. It's going to be a process over a matter of time.
Yeah. I mean, which always raises the obvious point, as in, well, the most used technology for money laundering and violation of the foreign asset control list is the use of cash. So thinking that the argument that's being made by the department here is that this is technology that's specifically used for that purpose, by that reasoning, every $100 note should be also then listed by its serial number.
This is a comedy of errors. It's like a bad movie.
Well, hey guys, in the broader scheme of things, I know, Chris, you don't want to lump all of the privacy concerns on the government writ large, but what does this really mean? Even if it's not upheld, even if they roll this back, right? I mean, we've got the Bank Secrecy Act, which is an anti-money laundering law that really is very privacy invasive, and we've got all of this push from regulators, the SEC being a large one, right? That wants KYC and anti-money laundering rules on every crypto platform that consumers likely to use. Do we have any financial privacy in the future of Web3 and DeFi?
Still to be determined. What about those central bank digital currencies?
Well, obviously there's none there.
Depends.
There's definitely none there.
No, depends,
I don't
honestly.
see any CBDC that's going to have any privacy.
No, honestly, I do, Jeff. I'm more optimistic there, because I had these discussions with a lot of officials that are in a position of influence on these topics. As you know, very long discussions for over a year now, and most of these discussions very strongly hint that these individuals think that privacy is at the center of these technologies that should be built in, right? That's why specifically the proposal of the central bank of the Federal Reserve Board stated that it should be anonymous, or it should be the digital equivalent of cash. So if it's actually the digital equivalent of cash, then you should be able to make anonymous transactions. And within our educational efforts, we point that out. But the larger point, I think that's more important here always, is to realize that technologies cannot be uninvented. So in this particular context, meaning from a technologist's perspective, having a tool that doesn't have the friction, so that doesn't require you to disclose a number of information, and that's not subject to censorship either by the government or for that matter by commercial banks who are kind of deputized by the government to fulfill these functions. That tool that provides basically the digital bearer instrument functions without adding additional frictions to it will just be better technology, right? So will just prove to exist and being used. Comes back to, if I'm someone who is undocumented, right? So if I can't even participate, if I wanted to, in the legacy financial system because I don't have the government issued credentials to qualify myself, well, then I'm going to turn to the best tool possible. So if that best tool is a digital bearer instrument that is denominated in a fiat that's relatively stable, then I'm going to turn to that and use that as my new language of value and tool to facilitate store of value function and payment functions, right? And again, it's always reminiscent of past ideas of government sanctioned entities to block things like voice over IP that we're using right now, right? Which ultimately will fail, right? Because technologies are extension of reality ultimately. So they will prevail. You cannot uninvent them. And the best technology, not always, but specifically in the realm of network technologies, will end up what I call least cost around any friction that regulators or otherwise entities in the power to mitigate this transfer will fix that, right? Technology is the solution, right?
Yep, that's just indicative of some very broad social issues and challenges that we have with the rise of all these technologies. And you're absolutely 100% right. Technology marches on, and the real challenge is, helping the government catch up in such a way that it doesn't stifle all this innovation and social good that comes about from these technologies. And that's a difficult battle that we're seeing firsthand this week.
Well, it's this, what is it, the Socraterian oath, right? Government should take on that same position as first do no harm, right? So that's what we got right in the first wave of what we call the internet today, and where government just stayed out of the way, and that worked out well. I think of all of these technologies just as the evolution, or not even the evolution, but like the instantiation of the real, what I would call World Wide Web, because that's really what we don't have. That's my constant gripe, as in we never developed the World Wide Web, right? We are always subservient to some database solution that some commercial entity usually is running. And so we are in that walled garden. I think a lot of people are catching on to the fact finally that we never developed the World Wide Web, but we just kind of moved on from AOL to then the walled gardens of Google, Facebook, JP Morgan Chase, whatever entity you're kind of dialing into using other bottlenecks.
Now you're digging into a whole other topic for another day, and that's the evolution. The evolution into Web 3, Web 5, Web 10, whatever you want to call it. I think we really are on the threshold of the dream, bringing that better dream to reality, again, through the slow march of technology. And I think I've read some very interesting things happening lately with digital identity and peer-to-peer communication without the central databases. It's there. The technology is there. It's just being cobbled together too slow for our liking. But yeah, there's some really exciting developments happening as we speak in that realm, and I'm confident that over the next 5 years we will see that dream achieved.
Yeah, I've always
thought, maybe that'll be for next week.
I've always thought that that identity and getting that right is really the key to preserving our privacy. We can do all the laws and stuff that we want, but if we can't get the technology of identity correct, we're going to fail.
That's right. And until that happens, you should never use your real identity on the internet.
Yeah, I'm pretty bad at that.
No, well,
I was just commenting on some YouTube streams on different topics and realized that I'm just being me on YouTube, which is probably not the best policy.
Well, ultimately, I think we will invalidate all of these systems that still have this friction, kind of as a forcing function of more authoritarian governments that are forcefully driving into the other direction. I think this should give us pause, and we should look to these governments and do exactly the opposite, right? To where within Russia, within China, you're required to divulge your real identity for simple things, getting a cell phone service, getting internet access. Sometimes you have to get a license if your blog exceeds 100,000 subscribers. Because you're a publisher now, you have to de-anonymize all the participants on the platform. So all of these efforts are leading into an entirely wrong direction. Like if we are serious about this American project of liberty, independence, then we should pay attention to these efforts that are happening under authoritarian governments and facilitate exactly the opposite so that we can free those people, because it doesn't only affect US citizens, right? Ultimately, everybody is affected by that, and that's another point that I usually make in the conversations with people at the Federal Reserve, because the US dollar in its physical instantiation is actually our most profitable export product. And that's the case because individuals around the world can use it to avoid the persecution by their own government. Again, and not for any nefarious reasons. More often than not, it's simply because they are opposing the government opinion and they want to change government to be more democratic and less authoritarian. So it should be in our interest, it should be in the interest of humanity at large to come to that particular realization that we have these alternative models. We don't have to do our own experiments here. We can just simply look at another country and seeing they're running these experiments right now. What are the consequences? And what are the consequences that we can see throughout history that these type of surveillance technologies led to? I think it's fairly obvious, so I don't know why we need to have the same discussion every time we see this government overreach leading towards these scenarios. But maybe that's just me and I'm naive.
No, it's not just you. These are common themes repeated by many people. We just don't have the right answer yet.
Yeah, and so maybe if people want to listen to this, want to listen or read a good book on this topic that I just finished, thanks to Jeff's recommendation, was a book called Just Crypto. It's crypto, and written by Stephen Levy, and it walks you through the history of the creation of cryptography and public key cryptography. And what stood out to me was a number of things, but the main one was there were a few people only that stood up to government overreach at the time. It was a handful of people, and people in our space know the name of every single one of these persons. And hopefully this time it's going to be more people, so that we don't have to identify individual people who sacrificed themselves towards that cause, but it's an outcry across our societies. Jeff, you're on mute.
Great point, Chris. And it's a great book too. Highly recommended. You know, I had one other thought, sort of orthogonal to this. I wonder if we could get chain analysis, or somebody to do an analysis to find out how many people that own crypto are connected to Tornado Cash in some way, like 1 level, 2 level, 3 levels deep. I mean, I bet you it's probably pretty interesting.
Yeah, and what we probably find out that we will identify some public officials.
Well, right.
Right.
Yeah.
I sent you some of that through Tornado a couple of days ago, Jeff.
Did you?
You dusted Jeff, Thomas?
No, I didn't do that. I just wanted to see your reaction.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but the point is that, I mean, it's probably ludicrous if you start actually looking at how many people are actually connected to it if you go, beyond one step or beyond direct, right?
Yeah, it's the same conversation we should be having. Do you know people who have used a virtual private network? Do you know people who have used HTTPS instead of HTTP? It's just silly that we're having this conversation.
Yeah.
Dollar free runs. Jeff, we're at the top of the hour. Do you want to lead us out and mention what we're doing next week?
Yeah, and also the name of the book is just Crypto, is called Crypto, and it's by Stephen Levy. I think it's the same guy that wrote the book on Steve Jobs. Stephen Levy book is called Crypto. And so the outro is, let me find my notes here real quick, Chris. So wanted to thank our guest, Tom Besor, and everyone who listened. This has been episode 26 of Your Bytes, Your Rights. I hope you'll join us next week for a discussion about privacy agents. It's going to be really good, talking about privacy agents that help customers exercise their DSAR rights to delete information from brokers and brands, and maybe some of them that are maybe not quite so legitimate. Anyway, we think you'll enjoy it. So join us here next week, and have a great weekend, everyone.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me.